Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight. And this is a very exciting story. The grandchildren, 3 of them, they're all boys, are gathered around their grandfather and their grandmother because they are hearing about an incredible story. And it's obviously got something to do with one of the members of the Magpie group, a man called Paul Mitchin, who was obviously being rather abused by his wife. So let's see where the story unfolds. It's a very exciting story, but before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get on with our story tonight. And this is where the story leads, to me and your grandmother making quite the decision, which, let's just say, led us into a wild adventure, one that we would never ever forget. Go on, Gramps. I'm eager to hear the story of yours. I've got a feeling it's going to be really good, said Keegan, his face breaking out into a satisfied grin. Very well, said my grandfather, his grey eyes suddenly fixing on me. Perhaps he could sense that he had my undivided attention. Me and my brothers did not so much as flinch as my grandfather began to talk. Indeed, the living room went so incredibly quiet as my grandfather drew back the curtains on a story that I had no idea I would find completely riveting. For at this point I had no idea what kind of journey this tale would take us on. Well, said my grandfather again, at the time I was sitting on one of those long wooden benches inside a bird hide, where all the magpies were gathered. We were all watching out for birds, because that's what you do in a bird hide. But I was sitting quite close to Robin Cartridge and Paul Mitchin, and I managed to overhear a conversation with them. Robin Cartridge was confiding in Paul Mitchin. He was talking about a magnificent cabin situated on a substantial acreage of land close to Banff, where there was plenty of bird hides on the property, built by the owner of the cabin, a very affluent man called Bridge Conaway, who also lived in Toronto, but would occasionally on the weekends go to his cabin retreat with his wife and family, where he would thoroughly enjoy spending his spare time watching birds. It was obvious from the way that Robin was talking about Bridge Conaway that Bridge was a man very passionate about bird watching, much like your grandmother and I, especially given he had so many bird hides built on his property around the lake area. I'm not exactly sure what Robin Cartridge's relationship was with the likes of Bridge Conaway, as he'd never so much mentioned the man in passing before to any of us magpies, who tended to know most of the passionate bird enthusiasts in Canada at the time. Anyway, my ears were flapping as I eavesdropped on their conversation. Robin Cartwright was telling Paul Mitchin that Bridge Conaway had told him that he and his family were welcome to stay at the cabin that weekend, as the Conaways themselves would be out of state, visiting relatives. Robin Cartwright accepted Bridge Conaway's offer immediately, with an eager enthusiasm, but then he suddenly remembered his wife's sister was turning 70, and they were planning to celebrate her birthday over the weekend at some special venue in Toronto. So he had to tell Bridge Conaway that although he couldn't accept his kind offer, he did have a friend called Paul Mitchin, who just might like to accept the invite on his behalf. Bridge Conaway said that if Paul was a good friend of Cartwright's, well, then he was a good friend of his as well, and that the man was more than welcome to use the cabin that weekend. Robin Cartwright was informing Paul Mitchin about the location and address of this elusive cabin in a sequestered part of Banff, and by the way he was describing the place, as I was listening, I felt rather like a dog drooling over my owner's T-bone steak, and looking for the first opportunity to steal it and gobble it up in a secret corner, without my owner knowing about my duplicity. I felt exactly like that. You should go, Paul, said Robin Cartridge, encouraging him. You might be able to get some quality time away from that obnoxious wife of yours. You could well do with a break. You deserve one. Maybe Esmeralda won't mind getting rid of you for an entire weekend. Maybe she'd welcome it. She won't have to throw a complete wobbly about your so-called bad table manners she's always accusing you of," he teased. "I understand the key to the cabin is under the front doormat. There is plenty of food and storage there that you are welcome to help yourself to. Bridge Conaway says you can help yourself to anything you like, including wine from that large cellar of his. It's an exquisite retreat, and the bird life on the property is absolutely incredible, owing, of course, to the large expanse of lake on the property that seems to go on forever. I'd very much like to accept your kind offer," said Paul Mitchin. "It's exceedingly tempting, but I don't think I'll be able to go, very sadly. You know what Esmeralda's like. You've seen her yourself. She claims she's got plans for this weekend, although what they are I couldn't tell you. She always tends to be very, very secretive about that kind of thing." "Well, if you change your mind," said Robin, "the place is accessible to you, and you're welcome to use it. I do encourage you to go. I think it will do you the world of good, and you certainly will not be disappointed. The bird life, as I was saying, is out of this world. Maybe if the worst comes to the worst, you can get Esmeralda to go with you. I know she's like a noose around your neck, but maybe a place like this gorgeous cabin in Banff might bring the best out of her personality." "You wish," chuckled Paul Mitchin, raising a cynical brow. "I don't think anything could put a smile on Esmeralda's face, unless, of course, it meant locking me away in one of the bedrooms at the cabin. Then I suspect that would make her very happy indeed." My brother Keegan stifled a laugh. "I've got a good idea what you're going to say next, Grandpa. You were young at the time, weren't you? You didn't have a lot of money. You realised that Paul Mitchin was unlikely to be going to the cabin near Banff for a weekend retreat, due to his wife Esmeralda. So you decided that you would seize the opportunity for yourself. You'd take Granny with you. Am I right, or am I right? I think I've got you figured out, Gramps, because if I was passionate about birds like you and Granny so obviously are, well, that's exactly what I would do." "Goodness gracious me, Keegan," said my grandmother with a giggle. "There's no pulling the wool over your eyes, is there? You're as sharp as a tack. You're right. Me and your grandfather were absolutely broke at the time. We didn't have much money, although your grandfather took on odd jobs from his father to make some extra money. But the extra money he made was never enough, you know. Your grandfather came to me and told me about the conversation he had overheard between Robin Cartridge and Paul Mitchin. At the time I'd been on the far side of the bird hide, getting very excited about a bird that I'd seen perching on an overhanging branch. I hadn't been privy to overhearing the conversation that Robin Cartridge had had with Paul Mitchin. Your grandfather was very excited about it all. He told me there was no way under any circumstances that he believed Paul Mitchin would go to the cabin that was close to Banff. He was completely under his wife's indomitable and yielding thumb. The cabin was in an exquisite area with a plethora of bird life, and he thought we should go, because we'd never get another opportunity like this again." "How did you feel about that, Granny?" asked Keegan a little cheekily. "I can't imagine you were terribly happy about staying in a stranger's cabin as an uninvited guest for the weekend. You've always liked doing things by the book, Granny." My grandmother chuckled and began to play awkwardly with her pearls. "Well, it was rather naughty. I know it was. And we shouldn't have taken advantage of staying in a cabin that did not belong to us. But when your grandfather talked about the bird life we would ultimately see there, then I'm afraid my resistance wore terribly thin. I mean, we could stay at the cabin for free over the weekend. We'd have the place all to ourselves. Well, it seemed like an idyllic, romantic opportunity for me and your grandfather to be together. We couldn't miss this opportunity. And we were sure that Mr. Bridge Conaway expected that Paul Mitchin would be using the cabin for that weekend. He wouldn't realise that a couple of youngsters had indirectly accepted an invite that had not been extended to them. In truth, I doubt if he'd actually known what was going on, that he'd have been that upset. I'm sure if he was penniless as a teenager and loved bird life, and was presented with a similar opportunity, that he'd have grabbed it with both hands, like we did. He wouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth, I'm most sure. I mean, the bird life in that part of the world is nothing short of sensational. So in other words, said Keegan, you didn't put up any resistance at all. Shame on you, Granny, he teased mercilessly. You were encouraging our grandfather to do a very naughty thing. The two of you were as bad as each other. Well, you get up to mischief when you're young. We were teenagers. I was 18. Your grandfather was almost 20. We were young, weren't we, William? Said my grandmother, her pale eyes looking at my grandfather adoringly. It was 1962, I believe it was, if I remember right. Even though it happened so long ago, it does feel like it only happened yesterday. Doesn't time fly? I think it's a stark reminder that me and your grandfather aren't getting any younger. But at the time, Keegan, it may be hard to believe, but we were round and about your age. We were both so passionate about birds. So I guess if the truth be told, we didn't allow ourselves to feel too bad that we were seizing this opportunity to stay at a special cabin. I mean, what could be better than that? It was incredibly fortunate that your grandfather had such a good photographic memory. Still does with his advancing years, you know. So he remembered the address very well. But my goodness, even with a map in hand and a compass, we struggled to find the location of this mystery cabin. The elusive area was heavily wooded, with a labyrinth of dirt roads, you see. It didn't help at all that everything was so badly marked. The dirt roads were in a sad old sorry state, covered in potholes everywhere, filled with muddy sludge, and water because of the recent rainfall. There had been lots of rain in the area, so that didn't help. Needless to say, your grandfather borrowed his father's red Ford Fairlane, I believe it was. We travelled down some of those very precarious roads in that Ford, and it became unstuck so many times, getting caught in the mud with its back wheels and refusing to move forwards or backwards. But luckily, thanks to your grandfather's ingenuity, he managed to get us out of some of those tight scrapes. By the time we managed to find the cabin and navigate our way rather cautiously around some of those dreadful potholes, the poor Ford looked as if it had taken a leisurely roll in a mud bath, like a contented pot-belly pig. I persuaded your grandfather we needed to hide the red Ford further away from the cabin, from prying eyes, by covering it with leafy green foliage, so that no one would know anyone was staying at the cabin. It was just a precautionary measure, I thought. I guess I appreciated the fact that we were intruders, taking advantage of an invitation extended to Paul Mitchin, but not to us. In hindsight, maybe we should have asked Robin Cartwright outright if we could take advantage of the cabin's facilities, as we were both members of the Magpie group. But it never occurred to us to do that. We knew Paul Mitchin wouldn't accept the invitation to stay at the cabin, as he was completely under Esmeralda's indomitable thumb, as we were saying earlier, which was why we'd stolen this opportunity for ourselves. And why not? It had been frustrating to look for the cabin. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, I have to tell you. But we were relieved when we saw the sign which read Lakeview Retreat, and lo and behold, we followed that tiny little road through a maze of tall, lofty trees. The road twisted and turned through the trees like a snake, and then broadened out into a flowery meadow, with mountain views overlooking the most enormous, all-expansive silvery lake, heavily stocked with fish, I believe it was. It glistened so magnificently in the morning sun, and stretched out over an extensive wide area, where there'd been many bird hides erected over the water's edge on stilts, that were just so perfect for bird-watching adventures. Well, me and your grandfather thought we had arrived in heaven. We'd never been to a place quite like this before. It was postcard perfect in every sense of the word, breathtakingly beautiful, wasn't it, William? It sure was, my grandfather agreed. But goodness gracious, what a laborious struggle it was to navigate our way around those dreadful potholes. So many of them, puddles everywhere, rocks, stones, you name it. So it was terrible trying to get to that cabin. The drive was an absolute nightmare in every sense of the word, and let's just say the cabin was so tucked away. If we hadn't seen the sign, we might never have found the place. I begged my father to lend me his red Ford. He'd been reluctant to do so, let me tell you. But finally, after much persuasion, he had agreed to lend it to me. I dreaded seeing how he would react if he observed the state of his red Ford now, especially if I returned it to him in this state after our trip. He wouldn't be remotely happy with me, let me tell you. Let's just say my father was a fastidious man in every sense of the word, and he kept that red Ford of his as shiny as a brand new pin. Anyway, once we found the cabin, I realized the hell we had been through to find this place had been very much worth our while, although I seriously doubted my father would ever agree to lend me his car again, and it turns out he never did. The first thing your grandmother said to me was that the cabin was like something out of a whimsical fairy tale. I guess I was expecting to find a rather run-down old miner's shack, but this cabin was nothing of the kind. It was incredibly stylish, and rather reminded me of a stunning Swiss chalet that rich people hire out for those exclusive skiing holidays in the Swiss Alps. It was luxurious in every single sense of the word, and had every modern convenience you could think about, with high balconies overlooking idyllic views of the Silvery Lake. Let's just say, if me and your mother had had to pay for a place like this for a weekend, it would have broken the bank, and in those days I certainly didn't have money. I was to learn later that Bridge Conaway was indeed a very wealthy man, who loved and adored birds, so he designed the cabin specifically for that, and there were bird hides strategically situated around the lake for his own personal enjoyment. I would have done much the same, had I been privy to having that kind of money. We knew straight away when we entered the cabin that the owner loved birds as much as we did. There were framed pictures of birds done in detailed watercolours all over the walls. The only word I can use to describe the cabin was it was absolutely stunning. Never seen anything like it in my life, I hasten to say. Your grandmother had brought her pet parrot Kiki along for the journey, and we let Kiki fly around the lake and around the cabin. Goodness gracious me, that parrot had the time of his life. I think he didn't want to leave. It sounds like you hit pay dirt, Grandpa, Keegan teased. I mean, staying at such a fabulous cabin like that, without having to part with a penny of your own cash, when you were both as poor as church mice. Well, that had to be pretty cool. But I can't believe you brought the parrot along with you. Well, that parrot went with your grandmother everywhere she went. When I married your grandmother, I was also committing to that parrot. But thank God Kiki liked me. But was always extremely possessive towards your grandmother, let me tell you. You know what, Gramps, said Keegan. I doubt the owner, what was his name again? Oh, you mean Bridge Conaway. That's right. Well, I doubt he would have really minded that you and Granny were staying at his cabin, because he was equally as fixated on birds as the both of you were. So you shared a lot in common, didn't you? You were birds of a feather, you could say. Well, you could say that, but it didn't make what we were doing right. The truth was I was convicted with a very sizable guilt when we arrived at the cabin, because I was very well aware that me and your grandmother were interlopers, intruding on private property that was not ours. Even as you say, we might have had a lot in common with the owners, as we shared a joint love of birds. What we were doing was wrong. If the cabin had been a bit run down, I guess I would have reasoned to myself that we weren't doing any harm. But the cabin was grandiose, so sumptuously appointed, and it made me feel conscious that what we were doing was more than a little naughty. Let's just say if my father had known what me and your grandmother were getting up to on that weekend, and that we were literally squatting in somebody else's property, he would have been less than amused, and he'd likely think he hadn't raised me right. I remember looking at your grandmother as we got to the front door of the cabin, and I actually thought twice about it. I said to her, "Shall we really do this?" Your grandmother chuckled and said, "Well, we've come all this way now, haven't we? I don't know about you, but I'm physically absolutely exhausted.
after navigating those horrendous dirt roads. And I'm too tired to care any more about morals, whether what we're doing is right or wrong. All I can say is thank God your dad doesn't know about any of this, because your life would not be worth living."
I will admit that I felt so worn out, so jaded, much like your grandmother. So I decided to hell with it. We're going to do this. We're going to stay at the cabin. The owner is away, and yes, the place is much more luxurious than we'd envisaged, but we were going to enjoy ourselves regardless. I reasoned with myself that this would be an intrepid adventure on our parts, that we would look back on with a keen fondness and a plethora of naughty giggles. We searched for the key, and were horrified to discover it was not under the front doormat, as Robin Cartridge had informed Paul Mitchin where it would be found. Luckily, your grandmother found it under a terracotta pot, close to the front door. We put the key in the lock, and the door swung open so smoothly. It was extremely well oiled. The attention to detail in that cabin was utterly extraordinary. Your grandmother, being the perennial romantic, insisted I carried her over the threshold, which I did. I put her down in the entrance hall, and we both stood there and gawked at the lavish furnishings. The place had been clearly kitted out by a very slick designer, who had thought of everything. The place was warm and inviting, with high ceilings and large, cheerful open fireplaces. There were big baskets filled to the brim with firewood, that were begging to be used on a cold evening. I promise you the cabin was luxuriously decorated in every sense of the word. No expense had been spared. There wasn't a speck of dust over anything. I think the place was regularly cleaned, possibly by a local in town. Me and your grandmother were not married, but in that quintessential moment it felt as if we were. I felt as if I was taking my beautiful bride to this very special place to celebrate our union. Soon we were exploring every nook and cranny of the cabin, and our initial guilt about squatting in the place as uninvited guests quickly subsided. We began to thoroughly enjoy ourselves and take advantage of all the facilities on offer, of which there were many, let me tell you.
"William, tell them about all the food in the cabin," my grandmother urged him, her eyes bright and shiny. "I'd never seen anything like it, let me tell you."
"Oh, the food in the cabin. Well, it was incredible," said my grandfather. "It looked like the select produce you would leave for royalty. The larder was a miniature room filled with a plethora of shelves, and on those shelves were so many canned delicious goods that looked like a home cook had prepared them all. It was something you'd expect to see in a very well-ordered Amish homestead. There were so many delicious stockpiles of food in that cabin, let me tell you, that if Armageddon had struck, well, you wouldn't have had any problems at all. You could have lived off that food for a couple of years with no problem at all. So I'm afraid to say your grandmother and I helped ourselves rather generously to the food, and we also drank some of the swine that we found in the cellar. And it was expensive stuff, let me tell you. Unlike the cheap plonk we were well used to buying that our parents didn't even know we drank. Every morning, me and your grandmother would get up very early, before the sun even rose, and then we'd go off to one of those bird hides, around various spots of the lake, and with our binoculars we'd make ourselves comfortable, and we'd start to watch the bird life." "And did you see anything?" my brother Keegan asked. "Spot any interesting bird life, perhaps?" "You bet," said my grandfather. "The variety in that part of the world, especially over a vast body of water like that, is breathtaking to say the very least. We did get to see some rare birds and other indigenous wildlife that came to the lake to enjoy a drink. We saw elk, white-tailed deer, moose, mule deer, wolverines, black bears, and even a grizzly on our stay there. So it was absolutely brilliant. We didn't expect to see so many things. It was on Sunday morning that we were hiding out in a bird hide that was not far away from the cabin. That was when we saw a car driving up to the lake, and we were absolutely shocked. We didn't expect anyone would come to the property, as we understood that the owners, the Conways, were away. Well, that was what Robin Cartwright had clearly made known to Paul Mitchin. We were a little affrighted and perturbed at the same time, that we could potentially be caught trespassing on private property that didn't belong to us. I wondered why the car was parking so close to the far side of the lake. I was focusing my binoculars on the lake, and the ugly mustard-coloured Ford Mustang was now parked on the pebbly beach on the furthest side, next to the fishing pier, and I could not help but think that the car looked strangely familiar, and that I'd seen it before, but I couldn't quite place it. With trembling hands, your grandmother looked at me, with wide, innocent eyes that were dappled with a grave concern.
Who the hell is that? Who is in that car? What are they doing here, William? I thought you said no one was coming to the cabin, the Conways' cabin this weekend. You said the Conways were away. That's why I agreed to come here with you, William, because the cabin was supposed to be empty. But now someone is here, and I don't even know who they are. But think about it. Our stuff is back at the cabin, in the main bedroom there. Our backpack of clothes. Maybe this person who owns the Mustang comes regularly to the fishing pier to enjoy a spot of fishing, and is going to go back to the cabin and find all our stuff there. Oh, what are we going to do, William? I knew we shouldn't have come here. Why did I listen to you? I knew we were tempting fate. For all we know, the owner could have had a change of plan and decided to come back to the cabin after all. I can't believe this has happened. Thank God we hid our car further away from the cabin so we can escape without being seen. As far as I'm concerned, I don't mind abandoning our backpack and all our clothes. I certainly don't want to cross path with the owner and admit that we've been taking advantage of his hospitality.
Keep your hair on, will you, love? I said to your grandmother. It may not come to that. You heard what Robin Cartwright said to Paul Mitchin. Well, at least I heard. And I very clearly heard him state that the owner, Bridge Conway, was definitely going away, that he'd be out of state. Think about it. This lake is very well stocked with lots of fish. My guess is that the Conways know quite a few folk living in the Banff area. So perhaps some of these people are invited to come fishing here. It would make sense to me. Or maybe this person, who is driving the Mustang, is actually trespassing like we are, and taking advantage of a fishing opportunity, while they believe the Conways are away.
But what if the owners didn't go away after all? Perhaps they had a change of plan and decided to come back to the cabin after all. Didn't Robin Cartwright say the owner of the cabin was a huge bird lover? So he probably comes back here at every given opportunity to pursue his passion for birds. That's why he built all these bird hides all over the place.
Emma, I think you're barking up the wrong tree. There's no way that the person driving the Mustang is Bridge Conway, or any of his family for that matter. For a start, I suspect they would be driving a much more fancy car. They're not short of a bob or two, are they? But whoever is in the Mustang, if they are connected to the cabin in any way, well, we're going to have to leave here forthwith, aren't we? As discreetly as we can, making sure we're not seen, and return to our car. Like you say, we'll abandon our clothes. We didn't bring much anyway, so it's not a train smash, is it? No one need ever know we were even here.
But what about my book of birds my dad gave me? I left it on the table in the hallway.
Well, if the worst comes to the worst, I'll just buy you another one. At this point, I don't mind admitting to you that my confidence was somewhat wavering. The mustard-coloured Mustang was certainly a blight to the beautiful scenery, as far as me and your grandmother were concerned, because we thought we had this place strictly to ourselves, and now there was an intruder on the premises. I was sure the man seated in the Mustang had come here with his fishing gear, and would soon begin to fish, which was why he'd parked his car very close to the fishing pier. In my mind's eye, I was certain me and your grandmother would shortly see this man pulling out a camping chair, along with fishing rods and an icebox containing some ice-cold beers, and then he'd start to fish. For a long while nothing happened. The car remained very still, almost as if the driver was not in a hurry to get out to begin fishing, and my burning curiosity as to the identity of this mystery person was beginning to kill me. Finally, at long last, the driver's side door opened. Me and your grandmother witnessed a blurry silhouette scrambling rather awkwardly out of the car and making his way to the trunk. Your grandmother was the first to let out a gasp. I asked her what on earth was wrong. She sounded incredibly shocked. I could hear that there was horror in her voice.
"Look,
William," she cried out.
"The man is pulling out a rolled-up carpet out of his trunk. You've got to be kidding me. This can't be happening. Oh, my God. There's a dead body in that carpet. I'm telling you, there's a dead body in that carpet. I'm absolutely sure of it. Something nefariously sinister is going on, William, I'm telling you. Oh, William! Oh, my goodness, it's a body. It really is a body. An arm has just dropped out of the carpet. And I'm not kidding either. Is this really happening, William? Please tell me I'm dreaming. I've got to be dreaming."
I focused my binoculars to where your grandmother was pointing. The man was holding a carpet in his arms. And sure enough, a white woman's arm dangled from the carpet. It was like something out of a horror movie, to say the very least. And let me tell you, my heart was drumming so loudly in my chest. I realized that we might be witnessing a murderer disposing of a body. And what better place than a large lake, where it would be eaten up by the fish and never seen again. The man was bending over the ground as he dragged the carpet over the wooden boards of the fishing pier. I could see he was struggling a little, as if the body was a little heavy. But when he got to the edge of the pier, overlooking the water, he began to unroll the carpet. And that was when me and your grandmother saw the body, that looked like that of a woman, lying on the carpet. She was obviously dead. I remember focusing on the woman's body. Her eyes were like marbles, staring vacantly into space. There was no doubt to my mind. She was definitely deceased. You should have seen your grandmother's face, boys. It was a picture, let me tell you. Her eyes were as round as saucers, and her jaw dropped wide open. As much like myself, she was struggling to believe we were witness to this strange event. I think the man, whoever he was, knew that nobody else was around on the property, so he could easily dispose of this body without being seen. I think he must have been very well aware that Bridge Conaway and his family were not on the premises that weekend, but little did he realize that he was being witnessed by two people. We could see the man staring down at the body for a long while. He ran his hand through his hair and looked like he was deep in thought. His movements suggested he was nursing a deep regret. We watched in horror as the man got to work in weighting the body down by tying bricks to the ankles, and then he picked up the woman's deceased corpse from the carpet and tossed it over the edge of the fishing pier, so that the body sank to the bottom of the water like a heavy stone. For a brief second he stared down into the water, and then he looked to the left and right, and then straight in the line of our focus. Maybe he sensed he was being watched, I'm not sure. It was in that quintessential moment that me and your grandmother both gasped in unison together, for we couldn't believe what we had just witnessed. It was both thrilling and terrifying at the very same time.
"Oh, goodness, William! I can't believe it! Oh, my goodness! It's Paul Mitchin!"
your grandmother cried out.
"He's only gone and thrown a deceased corpse into the lake. I think it's his wife, William. Oh, my God! He's always talking about how much he can't stand her, how he hates her. Oh, my goodness, William! He's murdered her. I can't believe we're witnessing all this. I think he came here to the cabin to dispose of the body. He thought nobody would be around and about, after Robin Cartwright told him he could have the place for the weekend all to himself. So he knew he could get away with murdering his wife. But we've seen him do it, William. Maybe he decided to murder his wife because he couldn't stand the sight of her any longer. He couldn't bear her constant nagging. It finally made him snap. Domestic abuse is very real, very much alive. And it can lead to murder, you know, when things get out of hand. I hear about it all the time on the radio."
Both me and your grandmother stared at each other in disbelief and confoundment, wondering what on earth we should do. We had witnessed Paul Mitchin offloading what we assumed was his deceased wife Esmeralda into the lake. We knew too well that there was no love lost between him and his wife Esmeralda. But why on earth had he not divorced the woman? Why would he resort to killing her? It made no sense to me. We watched Paul Mitchin rolling up the carpet he'd brought his wife along in, and replacing it back in the trunk of his mustard-coloured Mustang. Me and your grandmother knew, of course, that by informing the police as to what we had both witnessed, we would be admitting that we'd been illegally trespassing on Bridge Conaway's private property. But could we cover up a murder like this? The truth was, everyone in the Magpie Bird Club genuinely liked Paul Mitchin, as did me and your grandmother. People considered him to be a very good, upstanding man, unfairly caught up in a miserable marriage, where he'd been abused tirelessly by his condescending wife. I mean, of course, everyone felt sorry for him. But could we cover up a murder like this? Everyone in the Magpie Bird Club genuinely loved Paul Mitchin, as did me and your grandmother. I did feel very sorry for him to be trapped in such a miserable marriage. But I personally could not believe a man like him was capable of harming his wife. Yes, he did complain about her occasionally, when he was venting, but he was a gentle spirit by nature, so it seemed incongruous to us that he had done this despicable thing. But then again, sometimes the most innocent among us are capable of dreadful atrocities. I think for a long while me and your grandmother were completely shell-shocked. We didn't say a word to each other for quite a while. We watched Paul Mitchin scurry back to his car. Then he drove away. If we thought the movie we had just watched had come to an abrupt end, we were wrong. Things were going to get significantly more interesting, let me tell you. Your grandmother and me would never have anticipated in a million months of Sundays seeing what we saw that day. Your grandmother broke the silence when we began to fully assimilate the gravity of what we'd both witnessed.
What are we going to do, William? We've just seen Paul Mitchin dropping his wife's deceased corpse in the lake. But we shouldn't have been here in the first place to witness this. How do we explain our presence here to the police? Because we ourselves have committed a crime in staying here illegally, have we not?
Before I could answer your grandmother's very relevant question, she suddenly said,
"What is that, William?"
She pointed towards the furthest side of the lake, where we had initially seen Paul Mitchin remove his wife's deceased corpse from his mustard-coloured Mustang and discard it into the lake, where it had hit the bottom, as it had been weighed down by many bricks. Then he'd driven away from the area as fast as he possibly could, down some of those very precarious dirt roads. Now we were seeing two ambiguous black human-shaped silhouettes that were as wide as they seemed tall, covered in thatches of thick dark hair, moving swiftly towards the lake with a purposeful intent, as if whoever they were, they themselves had also been witness to what Paul Mitchin had just done. Me and your grandmother were looking very intently through those binoculars, our hands shaking excitedly. We had no idea what we were witnessing, but we do know now what they were. They were two Bigfoot, a male and a female to be precise. The male was of course significantly larger than the female, as you would expect. He looked like a fearsome, very impressive warrior. There was a scar running down his left cheek, and I noticed two of his fingers on his right hand were no more than stumps, so he must have got himself into a terrible scrape at some point.
My brother Keegan whistled at my grandfather's startling revelations about the Bigfoot he and my grandmother had seen. He was marvelling in the fact that they had been witness to such an extraordinary experience. I will admit my young teenage heart began to thump excitedly in my chest, almost as if hundreds of drums were beating all at the same time. I couldn't imagine how exciting would have been to witness a scene like that, but I was also miffed with my brother Keegan for interrupting the smooth flow of my grandfather's extraordinary conversation that had gripped the three of us, almost into a stunned stupor, you could say. Keegan, as usual, was up to his old tricks, interrupting at every given opportunity. I said nothing about the rude intrusions and whistling on my brother's part, and waited politely with bated breath for my grandfather to continue. When my grandfather talked about the Bigfoot, I couldn't help but notice his hooded, deep-set grey eyes lit up like two bright birthday candles, making him look as if he was 18 years old all over again. And suddenly I could see the young man he had once been, witnessing that paradoxical scene in that bird hide. It was for me the closest I've ever got to taking a trip back in time, all the way to the 1960s, a long time before I was ever born. There was a wistful look on my grandfather's face, as if the nostalgic indelible memories of that experience had brought him back to life again. I noticed instead of slouching back on his chair, with his shoulders slumped forward, and his expression extremely relaxed, he was now sitting up so straight, he looked as if he'd suddenly grown several inches taller. What my brothers didn't know was that I was nursing a secret of my own. The secret was that I was absolutely fascinated in the subject of Bigfoot, and had been since I was old enough to know about the cryptic creatures. I had longed for an encounter of my own, but never in a million years would I have ever believed for a single moment that my grandparents had seen two live Bigfoot with their own eyes, and they could have potentially gone to their graves without sharing their unorthodox encounter with us. And that would have been a travesty in my opinion. My grandfather wiped some sweat that had gathered away from his brow with the back of his hand. He asked my grandmother to go and get him a shot of whiskey, as this was a part of the story where he needed some Dutch courage to tell it. I watched him throw the whiskey at the back of his throat, so that it burned his tongue, and then he handed my grandmother the little glass back, and urged her to give him another shot. My grandmother raised a brow, but nevertheless obliged his request, filling his glass with yet more whiskey. The whiskey did the trick, because my grandfather started to visibly relax, almost as if the heat from the alcohol had anaesthetized some of the adrenaline-soaked memories of that event that had turned my grandfather, right before our eyes, back into that 18-year-old boy. "Go on, love," said my grandmother encouragingly, urging my grandfather to continue with the story. "Tell them what happened next. Can't you see the boys are now on the edge of their seats? They're looking at you with wide, wide eyes. Don't keep them in suspense a moment longer." "Well," said my grandfather, with a very big sigh, "I truly couldn't believe what I was witnessing with my eyes, and nor could your grandmother. These two Bigfoots, as I was saying, were male and female. Perhaps they were companions or partners, I don't know. They certainly looked to be that way. They were huge in size, but the male, well, I've never seen anything like him before. He was absolutely massive. I guess close up he could have been 10 foot tall, possibly more. The female, I'd guess, was about 8 foot. They were covered in dense, very thick, dark flowing hair, and were robustly built. I think the thing that amazed me most about the critters was how human they were. Their heads were pyramid-shaped, their necks short, their noses squat and flat against their faces, and their cheekbones very high. They were standing side by side each other on the fishing pier, looking down at the water, and talking excitedly together. The chatter went on for ages, as if they were discussing something at great length, and it was at that point I assumed they had seen poor Mitchin throwing his wife's corpse into the lake, so they knew exactly what was down there. All of a sudden both Bigfoot jumped into the lake from the fishing pier, and disappeared under the water for quite some time. They could hold their breaths, let me tell you. But the male Bigfoot emerged from the water, and brought out of the lake the deceased corpse of poor Mitchin's wife, Esmeralda. This male Bigfoot carried the corpse out of the water, with the bricks dangling from her ankles, and they laid her down on the wooden rafters of the fishing pier. They began to talk to each other in earnest. It seemed like the female Bigfoot seemed to be calling all the shots, telling the male Bigfoot what needed to be done, and he appeared to be nodding in agreement, as if they'd reached a decision of some sort. The male Bigfoot then dived into the water again, and came up to the surface with 2 trout in his hands, which he whacked on the ground very forcefully. I remember thinking, how the hell could this male Bigfoot catch 2 large trout with his bare hands under the water like that? I tried doing that as a boy, you know. The fish would fly past me. Imagine how nimble and quick-fingered you need to be to grab a fish under the water, and a sizable one at that.
and prevent it from slipping through your fingers like butter. The two Bigfoots sat on the edge of the fishing pier, their legs dangling into the water. They were extremely relaxed and unflustered, as if they had all the time in the world on their hands. They both began to casually eat the trout together, from the head of the fish, and they spat the tail out in the water. I think they even ate the bones, although I can't be sure. Then they rose to their feet, and the male Bigfoot just threw the dead corpse over his shoulders, and both of them just glided away into the woods, and were gone from our sight. "Oh, my God," said Keegan. "You don't think they were going to eat the body of Paul Mitchen's wife Esmeralda, do you, Gramps?" he asked, his eyes growing rounder by the second. "No, I certainly don't believe that. What I failed to tell you," said my grandfather, "is when the Bigfoots brought her body out of the water, they examined her closely, as if willing for her to still be alive. They treated her corpse with kindness, dignity, and respect, as if she was one of their own. So I would put money on it that they had no intention of eating her. The Bigfoot struck me as having emotional intelligence, which means they would exercise compassion. I'm not sure what they did with Esmeralda's body, but I'd like to think they buried her in a very nice, pretty place. Maybe they didn't want her deceased corpse to contaminate the lake, or maybe they thought it would be good to bury her in a more dignified spot. Let's just say, watching those two Bigfoot at work, I was struck by their humanity. They were very gentle with the corpse, and not exactly gentle with the fish they intended to eat. After the Bigfoot had all but gone, me and your grandmother remained in that bird hide for another 30 minutes or so, caught up in the shock of what we'd witnessed. I think we both felt we had been flung into an alternative reality.
"Oh, my God, William! Did we just witness that? Or am I going completely insane?"
"We sure did, love. I hate to burst your bubble, but no, this isn't a dream."
"What are we going to do, William?"
your grandmother asked me.
"Even if we went to the police and admitted to illegally squatting in someone's cabin over a weekend and watching Paul Mitchen dispose of his wife's deceased corpse, her body is now missing. It's been taken. If we tell the police this, and we tell them we witnessed two hairy human-like creatures steal her body, they'll think we're wasting their time and making up nonsensical stories. We'd look as stupid as hell, wouldn't we? I don't know about you, William, but I don't want to humiliate myself. I'm almost relieved, to tell you the truth, those big creatures took her body, because now we can put this all behind us, pretend it never happened. That's what I think we should do."
I agreed with your grandmother on this one, so we decided to keep storm. "So you're saying, Gramps, that Paul Mitchen never got into trouble for murdering his wife?" said Keegan, sounding very disappointed. "I mean, he did something atrociously evil. I know Esmeralda wasn't a nice person, but even she didn't deserve to die. If he hated her so much, he should have divorced her. That's what a normal man would have done." "You make some good points, son, but the story isn't over yet. I haven't even got started."
So there we are. That is the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.